Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to tonight's tales for the nocturnal historians like yourself. I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend some time with me as we embark on a journey through the hidden corners of history together. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. If you enjoy these calming and immersive dives into the past, I invite you to subscribe for more relaxing journeys through time. Now, make yourself comfortable, settle in, and let your mind wander as we travel back to a very different era. An era of kings and peasants, plagues and superstitions, rough justice and public spectacle. Imagine a bustling town square, filled with merchants hawking their wares, children playing, and animals milling about. But there's a palpable tension in the air. In the center of the square, a wooden platform stands, and upon it stands a dark, hooded figure, the executioner. This man, both reviled and feared, is an essential part of the brutal machinery of medieval justice. The crowd parts, as a ragged prisoner, is led to the platform, his hands bound. The executioner grips his axe and prepares to deliver the condemned soul to the next world. It's a grim scene, one that was all too common in towns across Europe for centuries. The medieval period was an age of harsh punishments. Thieves had their hands cut off, blasphemers had their tongues removed, and murderers, traitors, and heretics faced the ultimate penalty, a public execution. This could be by beheading, hanging, burning at the stake, or even more gruesome methods. At the center of it all was the executioner, a man tasked with the bloody business of torture and death. It's difficult for us to imagine the kind of person who could fill such a role. But behind the dark hood and fearsome reputation, the executioner was a human being with a life and a story all his own. Over the next hour or so, we'll delve into the shadows and uncover the true nature of life for the medieval executioner. We'll explore the path to becoming an executioner and the typical day-to-day responsibilities of this macabre profession. We'll meet some of history's most renowned and infamous executioners from France to England and gain insights into how they coped with their dark duties. Throughout this journey, we'll grapple with profound questions. What kind of society necessitates the existence of an executioner? How did executioners reconcile their grim work with their conscience and faith? And what does the existence of executioners reveal about the human impulse for retribution and violence? These are heavy questions, but as your eyelids grow heavy, I invite you to ponder them with me. Let your imagination roam free and see these distant lives and times through fresh eyes. So, let us embark on our tale in a bygone era when life was harsh, brutish, and short, and justice was swift and merciless. In this time, one shadowy figure loomed large in the public imagination, the hooded man with the axe, the medieval executioner. Our story begins, as many executioner stories do, with family. You see, the role of executioner was often passed down from father to son, sometimes spanning generations. In a world where bloodlines dictated so much of one's fate, even this grim occupation could become a family trade. Such was the case for one of history's most prolific and storied executioners, Charles-Henri Sanson of Paris. Born in 1739, Charles-Henri hailed from an executioner dynasty that traced its roots back to the 1600s. His great-grandfather, a common soldier named Charles Sanson, had first wielded the axe in service to King Louis I, the 13th. The Sanson patriarchs had been state executioners ever since, presiding over the execution of the king's enemies with practiced detachment. For Charles-Henri, following in his forefathers' footsteps must have felt almost inevitable. As a young boy, he watched his father, also named Charles, leave for the day's grim work. In the evenings, Charles would return, his dark cloak stained with blood and his eyes distant. Though they rarely spoke of it, young Charles-Henri understood that his future was intertwined with the blade and the block. Unlike other executioners who entered the profession by chance or necessity, Charles-Henri's path was predetermined. Consider François Barreau, a man who plied his trade in the south of France in the early 1500s. François had been an orphan, a ward of the church with limited prospects, until the day his town's aging executioner, childless and alone, took him under his wing as an apprentice. Under the tutelage of his old master, François learned the essential tools of the trade, the proper technique for swinging an axe, measuring a length of rope and tightening a rack. These were lessons in brutality, but to Francois, they were a means of escaping poverty, a way to earn a living and a way to find a place in the world, even if it was a low and despised one. Apprenticeships like these were common during the medieval period, when the secrets of the execution trade were fiercely guarded. A novice headsman might spend years assisting his master, mastering each technique through repetition and routine. Only when the old executioner retired or passed away could his apprentice assume the full mantle, donning the dark hood and cloak that symbolized his role as the town's dispenser of death. However, the education of an executioner extended beyond mere technical skill. He had to study anatomy, learning the precise angle to sever the head from the body, the exact pressure to snap the neck and spine. In a peculiar way, the executioner's primary objective was to minimize suffering. A swift and clean death was considered a mercy, a final act of kindness to the condemned. Moreover, the executioner had to endure the mental and emotional toll of his work. To witness agony and death day after day and still maintain composure was a formidable challenge. To feel the hot blood on his hands, hear the jeers of the crowd, and yet keep a heart of ice. It's no surprise that executioners were marked men, set apart from society by their terrifying duties. In France, executioners were required to wear distinctive red clothing off-duty to avoid being mistaken for ordinary citizens. In Germany, they often lived in a special house outside town, provided by the authorities, but shunned by the public. The training of executioners went far beyond the mechanics of killing. It prepared them for a life of isolation and infamy. This life demanded a terrible price, as we'll see. But first, let's imagine ourselves in the executioner's shoes on a day when his services are required. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the sleeping town. In his stone cottage on the outskirts, the executioner rises from a fitful sleep. He dresses silently, his mind already focused on the work ahead. He makes his way to the deserted town square in the early morning chill. There, he begins his preparations. He checks the scaffold, ensuring the trapdoor is well oiled and functioning. He inspects his tools, the axe, the rope, the pincers, and the implements of his trade. As he works, his mind wanders to the prisoner languishing in the dungeon, a beggar convicted of theft, or perhaps a young woman accused of witchcraft. He wonders if they'll meet their fate bravely or collapse in trembling fear. But it's not his place to question their guilt or innocence. That was for the magistrates and courts to decide. He is merely the instrument of their justice, as implacable and impersonal as the blade itself. By mid-morning, a crowd has gathered, townsfolk eager for a spectacle. The prisoner is led out, pale and shackled. The executioner guides them up the steps of the scaffold as a cleric reads out the charges and sentence. Then, it's time. With a whispered prayer and a steadying breath, the executioner takes up his tool. The prisoner kneels, bowing their head. A hush falls over the square. And in one swift, practiced motion, it's done. A life extinguished, a judgment meted out in blood. But the executioner's day is far from over. There's still the messy business of cleanup, disposing of the body, washing away the gore. And there may be other punishments to be carried out. A public whipping for a pickpocket, perhaps the removal of a blasphemer's tongue. Each sentence a fresh horror. As the sun sinks low over the town walls, the executioner trudges home, weary. His hood is spattered, his tools wrapped in stained cloth. He feels the townspeople's eyes upon him, fearful and accusing. Even the children scatter at his approach, called back by their mothers. Alone in his cottage, he contemplates the nature of his work. Is he a righteous servant of the law, or a base murderer sanctioned by the state? Does delivering a quick death truly absolve him, or is his soul forever stained? These are the doubts that plague the executioner in the dark hours of the night, the price he pays for his grim trade. And yet, come morning, he will take up the axe once more, for this is the only life he has ever known. Such was the lot of the average executioner, toiling day by day in obscurity. But some few names from this shadowed profession stand out in history, men whose deeds, for good or ill, ensured their own peculiar kind of fame. Pause. After the crowds had dispersed, and the last echoes of the condemned man's final pleas had faded into silence, the executioner was left alone in the town square, the weight of his grim duty heavy upon his shoulders. With methodical precision, he began the morbid task of cleaning up the aftermath of the execution. Blood stained the rough cobblestones, a macabre testament to the life that had been extinguished by his hand. The executioner moved with the efficient, practiced motions of a man who had performed this dark ritual countless times before. He gathered up the lifeless body, now devoid of the spark of vitality that had animated it mere moments ago, and prepared it for disposal. In some instances, the remains of the condemned would be claimed by their families for a dignified burial. However, more frequently than not, the earthly vessel of the executed would be unceremoniously dumped into an unmarked grave, forever lost to history. As the executioner worked, his mind wandered to the paradoxical nature of his existence. He was a man both reviled and revered, feared and respected in equal measure. His life was lived on the fringes of society, forever tainted by the blood that stained his hands. Yet simultaneously, he was a necessary cog in the machinery of medieval justice, a grim yet vital instrument in maintaining social order. This role had been thrust upon him by the accident of his birth, a family legacy passed down through generations like a dark heirloom. His father had been an executioner before him, as had his grandfather and great-grandfather before that. It was a lineage steeped in death and suffering, a dynasty built upon the foundation of the scaffold and the blade. From a young age, the executioner had been groomed for his grim destiny. He had apprenticed under his father, learning the intricate techniques of the trade, the precise angle at which to swing the axe, the proper tension to apply to the noose, and the most efficient way to separate head from body with a single swift stroke. He had studied anatomy, learning the secrets of the human form so that he might dispatch his victims with minimal suffering. However, no amount of training could truly prepare him for the emotional and psychological toll of the job. Each execution left an indelible mark upon his soul, a shadow that could never be fully erased. In the quiet moments between the blood and the screams, the executioner was forced to confront the weight of his actions, grappling with the knowledge that he had snuffed out a life, regardless of whether that life had been deemed worthy of extinguishing by the powers that be. It was a burden that few could comprehend, a pain that he was forced to bear alone. For all the fear and respect he commanded, the executioner was fundamentally a lonely figure. He lived apart from society, ostracized by the very community he served. His world was a realm of shadows and secrets, where the normal rules and rhythms of life held no sway. Perhaps the greatest irony of his existence was that he was more intimately acquainted with death than even those he dispatched to the afterlife. He had faced mortality daily, grappling with the fundamental questions of life and its value in a way few others could comprehend. Ultimately, the executioner was a man trapped between two worlds, the realm of the living and the domain of the dead. He straddled the boundary between light and darkness, forever caught in the liminal space between the sacred and the profane. It was a lonely and harrowing existence, but one he had been born to endure. As he finished his grim work and prepared to leave the now silent square, the executioner couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had led him to this moment. He had never sought this life, never aspired to be the messenger of death. But now, as he walked away from the scene of his latest act, he knew he would continue to fulfill his role as the impartial instrument of justice in a world that craved both vengeance and mercy. For he was the executioner, the final arbiter of life and death, the grim reaper incarnate. Though his existence was lonely and brutal, he knew it served a vital purpose in the grand tapestry of history. He was a necessary evil, a dark but essential thread woven into the fabric of medieval society. As he disappeared into the shadows of the night, the executioner carried with him the weight of the lives he had taken, the souls he had ushered into the great beyond. It was a burden he would carry for the rest of his days, a grim reminder of the terrible responsibility he had been entrusted with. Yet he would continue to fulfill it as long as there was breath in his body and strength in his arm. For the medieval executioner, life and death were intertwined in the service of death itself, a fate few would envy, but one he had come to accept as his own. A dark destiny forged in the fires of history and sealed with the blood of the condemned. Few figures loom as large or cast as dark a shadow as the executioner in the annals of medieval history. Theirs was a trade steeped in blood and shrouded in mystery, a grim vocation that placed them at the center of pivotal moments in human civilization. One such figure was Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris, who served under King Louis V during the tumultuous years of the French Revolution. Born into a dynasty of executioners that traced its roots back to the early 1600s, Sanson was destined to follow in the footsteps of his forebears. He would take up the mantle of the blade and the noose, dispatching nearly 3,000 individuals, from common criminals to aristocrats, over the course of his long and storied career. This staggering tally was a testament to both Sanson's skill and the sheer scale of the bloodshed that marked the French Revolution. Despite the grim nature of his work, Sanson was known for his professionalism and dedication to his craft. He took great pride in his ability to dispatch his victims swiftly and efficiently, minimizing suffering. In an era when public executions were often prolonged and gruesome spectacles, Sanson sought to bring a measure of dignity and humanity to the proceedings, ensuring a clean and merciful death for his victims. Even for a man as deeply entrenched in death as Sanson, the sheer volume of executions he oversaw during the Revolution took a profound emotional and psychological toll. In his private moments, Sanson grappled with the moral implications of his work, struggling to reconcile his duty to the state with his own sense of right and wrong. This struggle reached its climax on January 21, 1793, when Sanson was summoned to execute King Louis I himself. In a remarkable reversal of fortune, the man who had once wielded the power of life and death over his subjects was now at the mercy of the very instrument of justice he had once commanded. For Sanson, it was a moment of immense historical significance, a turning point in the story of France and the world. However, it was also a moment of profound personal anguish as he grappled with the weight of what he had been asked to do. Ultimately, Sanson carried out his duty with the same professionalism and skill he had demonstrated in all his previous executions. But the experience left an indelible mark on his psyche, a scar that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, Sanson continued to perform his grim trade, presiding over the executions of Marie Antoinette and countless other victims of the Reign of Terror. Yet even as he went through the motions of his dark ritual, he could sense the toll it was taking on his soul. As he entered his final years, Sanson turned his attention to securing his legacy, ensuring that the knowledge and skills he had accumulated over a lifetime of service would not be lost. He took on his own son as an apprentice, teaching him the secrets of the trade, just as his own father had done. It was a bittersweet moment for Sanson, as he contemplated the end of his own journey and the beginning of his son's. He knew all too well the burden that his child would be taking on, the dark mantle that he would be forced to wear for the rest of his days. But he also understood that it was a necessary evil, a grim yet essential service that would always be required. As he lay on his deathbed, his life's work finally complete, Charles-Henri Sanson could rest easy in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his destiny, contributing to the grand tapestry of history. He had lived a life in the shadow of the scaffold, a life steeped in blood and sorrow. Yet he had also lived a life of purpose and meaning, dedicated to the pursuit of justice, regardless of its dark and twisted nature. In the end, Sanson's story serves as a testament to the peculiar and intricate role that executioners played in medieval and early modern society. They were figures of fear and fascination, reviled and respected in equal measure. They embodied the state's ultimate power over life and death, the living embodiment of the idea that sometimes, for society to function, blood must be shed and lives must be taken. However, they were also human beings, individuals with their own hopes and dreams, fears and doubts. They were men and women born into a grim and terrible destiny, who accepted the mantle of death out of duty and necessity rather than choice. And it is in this duality that the true tragedy of the executioner's life lies. While they performed a vital service for their society, they were forever tainted by the nature of their work, forever set apart from the rest of humanity. They were the dark angels of the medieval world, the grim reapers who walked among the living, perpetually balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. This legacy echoes through the centuries, serving as a grim reminder of the terrible toll that the pursuit of justice can take on the human soul. And it is a legacy that we would do well to remember as we move forward into a brighter and more humane future. After all, the story of the medieval executioner is the story of us all. A tale of darkness and light, of cruelty and compassion, of the eternal struggle between the better angels of our nature and the demons that lurk within our hearts. It serves as a poignant reminder of our progress as a species and the challenges that lie ahead. As we reflect on history's grim annals, let us honor the executioners, those dark and tragic figures who played a pivotal role in shaping the world we know today. We must remember their skill, dedication, sacrifice, and sorrow. But above all, let us remember their humanity, the flickering spark of light that persisted even in the darkest corners of human experience. For it is this humanity that defines us, sets us apart from beasts and monsters, and provides hope even in the face of unimaginable acts. As we strive to build a better and more just world for ourselves and future generations, let us cling to this humanity. For in the end, we are all executioners in our own way, complicit in the grand drama of life and death that unfolds on history's stage. Yet we are also all human beings, blessed with the power to choose, change, and grow. And it is in this power that our greatest hope lies, a world where justice is tempered with mercy, cruelty gives way to compassion, and even the darkest corners of human experience are illuminated by understanding and love. So, let us remember the executioners, those grim and tragic figures who walked in the shadow of the scaffold. But let us also remember the light that flickers within us all, the stubborn spark of humanity that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how dark the night may seem. For in the end, it is this light that will guide us forward, leading us out of darkness into a brighter and more hopeful tomorrow. And it is that light that will ensure that the story of the executioner, despite its sorrow and tragedy, ultimately becomes a tale of hope. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit will always find a way to endure, overcome, and triumph. As the executioner's heavy footfalls echoed through the dungeon passageway, the condemned man's ragged breath quickened. Flickering torchlight danced across damp stone walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. The prisoner rattled his chains in a futile plea, but the executioner's face betrayed no hint of mercy. This was merely another day's work for him, another wretched soul to dispatch. Many assumed the medieval executioner was little more than a mindless brute, a sadist who reveled in the gruesome task of dealing death. However, the reality was often far more complex. For most executioners, this macabre profession was a family trade passed down through generations, almost like a dark inheritance. Young boys weren't given a choice. As soon as they were old enough, they began apprenticing under their fathers or uncles, learning the grim tools of the trade that would forever set them apart. Training was rigorous, a process of both physical and mental conditioning. A swift, precise death was considered the bare minimum of competency. Executioners had to master a wide array of instruments, from the iconic axe and sword to more esoteric devices like the breaking wheel. Each required a different technique to ensure maximum efficiency. But brute strength alone wasn't enough. Executioners also needed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, a keen awareness of where to strike to bring a swift end. They pored over medical texts and studied the bodies of the dead, learning the map of blood vessels, organs, and bones. A botched execution could mean prolonged agony for the condemned, and that simply wouldn't do. Not out of compassion, mind you. A clean death was simply a mark of professional pride. Perhaps even more crucial than the physical skills was the mental conditioning endured by an apprentice executioner. To gaze into the eyes of the condemned day after day, and then swiftly snuff out their lives without flinching demanded a certain resilience of spirit. Some labeled it cruelty, while others deemed it necessity. As part of their rigorous training, young executioners were compelled to confront death in all its forms. They accompanied their mentors to public tortures and executions, observing impassively as bodies were broken and blood spilled. Through this exposure, they learned to tune out the screams and pleas, steeling their hearts against the raw human desperation on display. It was a challenging yet essential lesson. Hesitation or mercy had no place on the scaffold. Of course, not every aspiring executioner could withstand the emotional toll of the job. It required a unique kind of person to kill without guilt or doubt. Some apprentices faltered, unable to endure the relentless parade of death. However, those who persevered emerged transformed in profound ways. They had gazed into the abyss of human suffering and emerged on the other side. Upon completing their training, a new executioner assumed his role as a pillar of the medieval justice system. His position was peculiar, reviled, and indispensable in equal measure. Townsfolk might avert their gaze as he passed in the street, but they also slept more soundly, knowing he was there, a grim guardian safeguarding order from chaos. But what did a typical day entail for an executioner? As dawn's first light crept over the horizon, he was already up and preparing for the grim work ahead. There were blades to sharpen, ropes to inspect for fraying, and a myriad of other meticulous tasks to manage. A malfunctioning tool could spell disaster on the scaffold. Executioners' mornings were often spent presiding over public displays of punishment, a crucial aspect of the medieval justice system. Petty thieves might be whipped until their skin hung in bloody ribbons, while more serious offenders could lose an ear, a hand, or even a limb. Throughout the day, the executioner stood impassively by, his face a mask of professional detachment. As the time for the execution drew near, crowds began to gather in the town square, jostling for a good view of the macabre spectacle. The mood was strangely festive, with vendors selling meat pies and ale to the eager onlookers. Public executions were the medieval equivalent of mass entertainment, a brief respite from the drudgery of peasant life. The executioner remained a figure of fear and fascination. Children dared each other to touch his black robe for good luck, and some even believed his sweat or blood could cure ailments, a superstition the executioner was all too happy to exploit for a few extra coins. Finally, the appointed hour arrived. The condemned was led out, hands bound, face pale with dread. A priest muttered last rites, though any hope of divine mercy seemed laughably hollow. The executioner tested the edge of his blade, adjusted the block, and then, with a nod from the magistrate, it was time. A hush fell over the crowd as the executioner took his position. The world seemed to narrow to that one moment, that singular act of violence. With a whistle of steel through the air, it was over in an instant. The head tumbled into a waiting basket, a spray of vivid crimson staining the stage. As the crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, the executioner calmly wiped his blade clean. For him, death was simply a job like any other, but even he couldn't escape a twinge of something. Not quite remorse, but a grim acknowledgement of the weight of his actions. Each life he took left an invisible mark on his soul, a dark stain that could never quite be scrubbed away. With the execution complete, there was still much to be done. The body and head had to be gathered up for display or disposal. The blood had to be scrubbed from the scaffold, and the tools had to be cleaned and put away. An executioner's work was never truly finished. As the last crimson hues faded and the crowd dispersed back into their lives, the executioner retreated to his secluded abode on the town's outskirts. Even among the most impoverished and desperate, few desired an executioner as a neighbor. The miasma of death clung to him, an invisible barrier isolating him from the rest of humanity. Yet even in his solitude, the executioner couldn't escape the haunting spectre of his grim trade. The faces of the condemned haunted his dreams, their final moments of pleasure etched in his mind. Some turned to drink to numb the memories, while others became consumed by religious fervor, desperately seeking absolution for their bloody deeds. But for most, the life of an executioner was one of grim acceptance. They were the sin-eaters of medieval society, the ones who shouldered the burden of necessary violence so that others could sleep with a clear conscience. It was a lonely and damning path to walk. One of the most renowned executioners to walk that path was Shah Hiri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born into a dynasty of executioners dating back to the 1600s, Sanson was practically destined for the role. However, even he grappled with the toll of the job. Over his extensive career, Sanson personally executed nearly 3,000 souls, ranging from common thieves to aristocrats and even the king himself during the Reign of Terror. He took pride in his work, viewing it as a vital public service. Yet, he also sought to minimize suffering whenever possible, pioneering a more humane method of execution with the swift slice of the guillotine. As the revolution raged and orders poured in, Sanson found himself grappling with a growing sense of doubt. Each trip to the scaffold chipped away at his resolve and his belief in the righteousness of his actions. In the quiet moments, the faces of his victims, men, women, even children, swam before his eyes. Sanson was a man torn between duty and conscience, a living embodiment of the executioner's paradox. He had been born into this life, molded for it since childhood. As the years passed, the weight of all that death began to crush his spirit. Despite his stoic professionalism, something inside him withered and died. In the end, Sanson did the only thing he could. He poured his knowledge into his eldest son, preparing him to take up the family mantle. It was a bitter inheritance, one that would doom his child to the same twilight existence. But in a society built on blood and steel, the executioner was a necessary evil. Someone had to bear that cross. Not all executioners were tormented by their lot as Sanson. Take Thomas à Cerne, the hangman of Yorkshire in the late 1500s. While he executed criminals with brutal efficiency, Ascan always sought a way to profit from his grim reputation. He devised a clever scheme, selling talismans and cures allegedly imbued with the power of his deadly trade. Scraps of hanging ropes, locks of condemned hair, even vials of his own bathwater were marketed as powerful remedies for everything from toothache to infertility. Never mind that it was all hogwash. The fearful and desperate flocked to buy Assan's grisly wares, hoping to harness some of the executioner's dark mystique for their own purposes. And Assan was all too happy to oblige, pocketing a tidy fortune in the process. It was a testament to the executioner's peculiar place in the medieval psyche, feared and reviled, yet also imbued with an almost supernatural aura in a world steeped in blood and superstition. Even the lowly hangman could become a figure of legend. Of course, the reality was often far less glamorous. For every Thomas à Cerne working the crowd, there were dozens of executioners living in squalor and despair, shunned by the society they served. Many sank into madness or took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of their bloody deeds. It was a thankless existence that left even the strongest men hollowed out husks of themselves. They wielded immense power over life and death, these reapers of men, yet at what cost to their own souls? As the centuries passed, transitioning from medieval times to the modern era, the executioner's role underwent significant changes. Public spectacles of death gradually lost favor, giving way to more clinical and bureaucratic methods. The gallows and chopping block were replaced by gas chambers and electric chairs, impersonal instruments of state-sanctioned death. Despite these advancements, the shadow of the executioner persisted. Johann Reichardt, Bavaria's chief executioner in the early 20th century, bore that shadow as heavily as any of his medieval predecessors. A quiet and unassuming man, Reichardt executed nearly 3,000 prisoners throughout his long career, including several high-ranking Nazis in the aftermath of World War II. Like his predecessor Sanson, Reichardt grappled with the moral burden of his work. He sought solace in scrupulous adherence to procedure, believing that he was merely an instrument of the law. However, in the quiet moments of the night, doubts crept in, and the faces of the deceased appeared before him in silent accusation. Ultimately, Reichardt met the fate of many executioners before him, a gradual descent into obscurity, his name fading from public memory as the world progressed. The once formidable figure of the headsman had become little more than a historical curiosity, a relic of a darker and bloodier era. Yet despite the progress we often believe we've made, the spectre of the executioner remains ever present. In certain parts of the world, public beheadings and stonings continue to be grim realities. Even in supposedly civilized nations, the machinery of death operates behind prison walls, sanitized and industrialized, yet no less final for its victims. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the executioner, not the gore and spectacle, but the unwavering reminder of our own capacity for brutality. Throughout history, we have found ways to justify the unjustifiable, to cloak violence in the guise of justice. In our pursuit of justice, we inadvertently create the need for those grim, haunted men who commit heinous acts in our name. Let us spare a moment of reflection for the executioners of old, those damned souls who walked in the shadow of death. Their burden was immense, a sacrifice of spirit on the altar of necessary evil. In the end, perhaps they were not so different from their victims, both trapped in the relentless gears of a merciless machine driven by the weight of human cruelty. As we close our eyes and drift into the merciful oblivion of sleep, Let the story of the executioner serve as a poignant reminder to hold fast to our humanity, even in the face of the darkness within. For it is not the axe or the rope that defines us, but the choices we make and the compassion we show in the fleeting moments of life we are granted. Let us use these gifts wisely and with great care. As the sun descended below the horizon, the executioner methodically wiped down his heavy blade, his eyes fixed on the task with a grim determination. Tomorrow would bring yet another public beheading, a young noble woman convicted of adultery. The crowd would erupt in jeers and cheers as her head rolled, but for the executioner it was all part of his daily routine. This was the life of the medieval headsman, a figure both reviled and revered in the minds of the people. On one hand, executioners were seen as a necessary evil, the grim enforcers of justice who maintained order in a turbulent world. They were the ones tasked with delivering the ultimate punishment to those who defied the laws of God and man. In a time when life was often brutish and short, the executioner's swift blade could be perceived as a mercy, a quicker end than a slow death from disease or starvation. However, despite their vital role in society, executioners were also deeply feared and loathed. To kill in the name of the law was still to kill, and those who dealt in death were often shunned as pariahs. Many executioners lived solitary lives on the fringes of towns, forbidden from mingling with ordinary folk. Even their own families were tainted by association, their children mocked and ostracized. It was a heavy burden to bear, taking a profound toll on the minds and souls of those who wielded the axe. Depression, madness, and drink were all too common among executioners, the weight of their dark deeds eroding their humanity bit by bit. Some found solace in religion, fervently praying for the forgiveness of the lives they'd taken. Others simply hardened their hearts, becoming little more than tools of the state. But how did one even become an executioner in the first place? For many it was a family trade passed down from father to son in an unbroken line of blood and steel. The skills of the headsman, the precision of the axe stroke, and the knack for knots in the noose were not easily learned. They had to be absorbed through years of apprenticeship and grim practice. From a young age, executioner children would assist their fathers in the grisly work, sharpening blades or binding the wrists of the condemned. They watched and learned, steeling themselves for the day when they too would take up the heavy mantle. It was a strange and morbid inheritance, but one that could also confer a certain status. After all, not just anyone could be trusted with the power of life and death. Those executioners who didn't have the luxury of a family legacy had to find other paths into the trade. Some started as common criminals themselves, spared the noose on condition that they turn their hand to the task of execution. Others were simply men of violence and ill repute, drawn to the grim work by a taste for blood or the promise of steady employment. Regardless of their origins, all executioners had to undergo a rigorous apprenticeship before they could apply their trade alone. This wasn't just a matter of learning the mechanical techniques of killing, it was of preparing oneself mentally and emotionally for a lifetime of dealing death. A key part of the training involved the study of human anatomy. A skilled executioner needed to strike precisely to bring a swift end, minimizing the condemned's suffering. This required countless hours spent studying medical texts or even secretly dissecting executed bodies to comprehend muscle and bone mechanics. However, no amount of book learning could truly capture the visceral reality of the task. That could only be achieved through hard experience, repeatedly taking up the blade until the sight and sounds of death no longer revolted the stomach. It was a brutal initiation, a baptism in blood that left an indelible mark on even the toughest men. Those who survived their grim apprenticeship became journeymen executioners, traveling from town to lend their services as needed. It was a ruthless and unglamorous existence, but it provided many young headsmen with their first real taste of the power and responsibility that came with the job. They presided over public tortures and mutilations, drawing out the suffering of thieves and heretics for the baying crowd. They performed executions from the lowest poachers to errant dukes and duchesses, and always they bore the weight of their fearsome reputation, cloaked in the dark garb of their trade. Some executioners even became minor celebrities, renowned far and wide for their skill and showmanship on the scaffold. One such figure was the great French headsman Charles Héry-Son, a man who infused the business of death with a touch of grim artistry. Born into a venerable dynasty of state executioners, Sanson was a master of the cold steel, the gleaming blade of the guillotine. Throughout his long and bloody career, he personally executed nearly 3,000 souls, from common criminals to the King of France himself. Sanson took perverse pride in his work, viewing himself as an agent of the law rather than a brutal killer. He pioneered innovative techniques to minimize suffering, such as the swift downward slice of the bascule instead of the clumsy lateral chop of the old Halifax gibbet. Even during the Reign of Terror, when Paris streets ran red with noble blood, Sanson maintained his professionalism, a steady hand amidst chaos. However, beneath the black mask, Sanson grappled with profound conflict. In quiet moments, he agonized over the morality of his profession, wondering if a merciful God would forgive him for the blood on his hands. Seeking solace, he scribbled melancholic verses in his journal late into the night. As age and infirmity dulled his legendary skills, Sanson became increasingly preoccupied with his legacy. He took on his own son as an apprentice, determined that the family tradition would endure despite the changing world. It was a heavy inheritance, but the young man shouldered it with the same stoic resolve as his father. Sanson's story encapsulates the peculiar duality of the executioner's life. At once reviled and essential, steeped in death, yet clinging to a sense of higher purpose. This contradiction was a struggle for many of his colleagues as they carried out their grim duties. In England, the hangman Thomas Ascon found a unique way to reconcile this paradox. By day, he was the feared figure of the gallows, a hooded spectre looming over the trembling condemned, but by night, Ascon pursued a clandestine second career as a purveyor of macabre medicines and charms. Utilizing his privileged position, Ascon harvested grisly ingredients from the bodies of those he executed, the fat of hanged men, the burnt powder of human bones. He mixed these into ointments and potions, which he sold at a hefty profit to those desperate enough to believe in their curative powers. Ascan's most prized possession was the very ropes he used for his hangings. After each execution, Ascan would cut the noose into small segments, which he marketed as talismans against various ailments. It was believed that a piece of Ascan's rope, worn close to the skin, could cure everything from headaches to impotence. The hangman even bottled and sold the bathwater from his own tub, claiming that it had absorbed the mystical essence of his fearsome profession. Gullible customers lined up to purchase this morbid holy water, some even traveling from Farfield for a sip of the executioner's healing tonic. While Ascan's scheme may appear like a macabre joke today, it reflects the peculiar hold that executioners had over the public imagination, despite being despised and marginalized. These grim figures were also perceived as possessing an eerie power, an intimate familiarity with death, which granted them an almost supernatural aura. This was the executioner's paradox, to be both necessary and unclean, essential yet utterly abhorrent. It was a tightrope that every headsman had to walk, navigating the turbulent waters of a society that both required their skills and recoiled from their touch. Some executioners embraced their fearsome reputations, using them as a tool for social advancement. In medieval Germany, executioner dynasties like the Reichardts passed down their trade from father to son, establishing a kind of grisly aristocracy. They held a place beside princes and archbishops in the intricate hierarchies of the Holy Roman Empire, respected for their service to the state, even as they were shunned in the streets. Others struggled under the weight of their dark calling, succumbing to the psychological strain of legalized bloodshed. Heavy drinking became an occupational hazard for those who couldn't stomach the work sober. Some executioners turned to religion, generously donating to the church in an attempt to redeem their tarnished souls. Still others descended into madness, babbling to themselves as they paced the draughty halls of their lonely homes. The renowned Bavarian executioner Johann Reichard was acutely aware of the profound toll his grim profession could exact. By day, he diligently fulfilled his role as the state's loyal servant, executing criminals and dissidents with unwavering efficiency. However, as night descended, the haunting echoes of the dying's screams reverberated incessantly in his dreams. Reichard found himself the last of a dwindling breed. In an era marked by the crumbling of old certainties and the relentless advance of the Nazis across Europe, he continued to operate in secrecy, his services still indispensable to a regime that favored the firing squad over the executioner's blade. Yet even Reichardt could discern the inexorable decline of the executioner's age, rendered obsolete by the cold efficiency of the gas chamber and the mechanized slaughter of the concentration camps. Ultimately, Reichardt met his own grim fate at the hands of the victorious Allies, condemned as a war criminal for his minor role in the Holocaust. It was an ignominious end for a man who had only ever perceived himself as a mere servant of the law, a cog in the justice machine. As Reichardt embarked on his final journey, he might have contemplated the peculiar and dreadful trajectory of his profession. From the medieval town square to the blood-soaked abattoirs of the modern age, the executioner had always been a paradoxical figure, reviled and indispensable in equal measure. Yet in the end, even the most illustrious dynasties of death could not escape the judgment of history. Today, the image of the hooded headsman appears as a relic of a bygone era, a spectral figure from the darker chapters of human history. Nevertheless, the legacy of that grim trade continues to linger in the shadows of our collective consciousness. While we may have replaced the gallows with the gurney, the axe with the syringe, the need for a final arbiter of justice endures, and so too does the executioner's burden, the peculiar and dreadful weight borne by those who take lives in the name of the law. This weight has crushed countless souls throughout history, yet it has simultaneously upheld the edifice of civilization. In the end, perhaps that is the executioner's true legacy, reminding us of the darkness lurking beneath the veneer of justice and the toll paid by those who serve as its instruments. As the first rays of dawn filter through the shuttered windows, the executioner rises from his uneasy slumber. Draped in his black hood and heavy gloves, the uniform of his ancient trade, he gazes at the heavy blade on the wall before stepping out into the morning chill. The world may change, but the executioner's work remains constant. It's a heavy burden, yet one he will shoulder for as long as the law demands. Such is the lot of the medieval headsman, the grim hand of justice in a world of blood and steel. The life of an executioner was one of isolation and inner turmoil, a constant wrestling with the weight of their grim responsibilities. Despite wielding the power of life and death, it came at a steep personal cost. Many executioners turned to vices like drinking or gambling to numb the emotional toll. Some descended into madness, haunted by the faces of the condemned, yet even in their lowest moments, executioners held a strange status in medieval society. They were outcasts, yet also revered, or at least feared. Their knowledge of life and death made them sought out not just by the courts and kings, but by desperate common folk as well. Picture the scene: a hooded executioner, his weathered hands wringing a length of rough hemp rope as a stream of townsfolk approaches, bearing coins and trinkets. They've come to beg for scraps of the hangman's rope, believing it can cure their ailments or ward off evil spirits. The executioner obliges with a knowing nod, playing the part of a mystic healer. This was the clever scheme of Thomas Ascan, a 16th-century hangman in Yorkshire, England. Ascan realized that even as his neighbors shunned him in public, they would still furtively seek him out for favors, and so he provided the people with what they desired: talismans, potions, and blessings from an agent of death. Ascan would soak lengths of execution rope in his bathwater and sell them at a premium as holy water cures. He carved pieces of the wooden gallows into amulets and sold personal items from the condemned as morbid relics. It was all quite sacrilegious and undoubtedly a sham. However, Ascan soon amassed wealth from his side business. The irony was lost on no one, perhaps least of all Ascan himself. By day he was a pariah, but by night he was a paradoxical savior, peddling life through instruments of death. The same hands that ended lives by the dozen were then turned to hawking counterfeit cures. Ascan may have been a conman, but he was a shrewd businessman above all. He knew he would never be accepted in respectable society. So instead, he met the people where they were, in the fearful shadows. He exploited his own sinister reputation and the superstitions of the age to carve out a more comfortable existence. It's difficult to determine if Ascan truly believed in his own schemes or was simply a pragmatic opportunist. Perhaps in his own way, he found a deeper meaning or atonement in this double life that made his lethal day job more bearable. However, the Ascan story illustrates the mental gymnastics and subtle deception that executioners often resorted to in reconciling their place in the world. For as much as executioners were integral to medieval life, they paid a heavy price to fulfill their role. The very thing that gave their lives purpose also barred them from inclusion and normalcy. They were essentially prisoners and victims of the system, just as much as those they put to death. Men like Ascan found ways to profit from their grim reputation, while others retreated into hermit-like isolation. Yet throughout Europe over centuries, executioners grappled with the same fundamental struggle between duty and conscience, power and posthumous glory. Charles-Henri Sanson, the renowned executioner of Paris, lived a life defined by the struggle between his duty and his conscience. Born in 1740 into a lineage of state executioners, Sanson's fate was sealed from birth. Execution wasn't merely a profession for him, it was an inescapable birthright. Under the tutelage of his uncle, Sanson honed his craft, learning to execute the king's justice with precision and speed. A prodigy, he mastered various execution methods, from drawing and quartering to beheading with different swords. However, beneath the icy professionalism, Sanson harbored reservations about the toll and fairness of his work. He came of age during a time of growing unrest and intellectual upheaval, when Enlightenment ideas about justice and individual rights were spreading. The old ways began to feel increasingly brutal and arbitrary, prompting Sanson to question the morality of torture and the disproportionate targeting of the poor by the justice system. Trapped by the gravity of his family legacy and his duty to the crown, Sanson was an integral part of the system. He questioned, bound by reputation, oath, and the immense pressure to uphold the dark Sanson dynasty. By the time revolution erupted in France in 1789, Sanson was already a master executioner. His services would be in high demand as the people turned against the ruling aristocracy. Despite playing his part in enacting revolutionary justice, Sanson's doubts gnawed at him. He executed errant royals and troublesome rebels alike, including King Louis XVI himself in 1793. Each thud of the guillotine blade weighed heavily on his conscience. Like many executioners, when off duty, he turned to opium and alcohol to numb his pain and anguish. Ultimately, even in the overthrow of the French state, Sanson remained loyal to the French nation. He followed his orders diligently, as a good soldier would, though later writings revealed the trauma and internal conflict he carried. He personally executed nearly 3,000 people, and the nightmares and guilt never left him. Despite his brooding and soul-searching, Sanson never broke the chain of family legacy. In his final years, he focused his energy on tutoring his own son, Henri, in the dark art of execution. The boy would one day inherit his mantle and carry on the Sanson name in blood and beheadings throughout the Reign of Terror. The mental and emotional anguish Sanson suffered was the executioner's omnipresent shadow. The nature of the work practically guaranteed post-traumatic stress and deep psychological scars. This was another reason executioners tended to work in family dynasties. The trade required an understanding and hardiness that outsiders lacked. Only a fellow executioner could truly comprehend the weight of the role. They were a brotherhood bonded by blood and the uniquely challenging headspace required. Many executioners followed their father's footsteps not out of bloodlust, but because there was simply no one else who could relate to their experience. This created an insular subculture of executioners across Europe who saw their grim business as a higher calling. They took pride in their esoteric techniques and in their mental fortitude to carry out such a taxing task. Only they knew what it took to be the hand of the law. This executioner's mindset is exemplified in the person of Johann Reichardt, who holds the dubious distinction of being the last official executioner in Bavaria, Germany. Reichardt, who hailed from a 400-year lineage of Bavarian executioners, beheaded nearly 3,200 people between 1924 and 1945. Many of Reichardt's victims were petty criminals, political prisoners, or other unfortunate individuals caught in the draconian Nazi justice system. He served the Third Reich with the same sense of dutiful detachment as he had the Vichy Weimar government before. Though he later claimed to be no Nazi supporter, Reichardt's role was not to question, but to carry out his orders. In the first few months of 1945 alone, he reportedly executed over 200 people. He approached his task with remarkable Germanic precision and an uncanny stamina, sometimes conducting dozens of executions in a single day. Fellow Nazi executioners described him as a consummate professional with an unwavering composure. When American forces captured Reichardt at the war's end, he admitted to his role but portrayed himself as an apolitical civil servant, a reluctant cog in the machine. In his mind, he had simply done his duty by following all official state orders, regardless of how distasteful they were. The Americans released Reichardt, and he attempted to resume a quiet civilian life. However, his reputation, like the bloodstains on the well-worn wooden execution block he had inherited from his father, would never be erased. He lived out his final years in lonely ignominy, shunned and conflicted, forever bound to his dark past. Reichardt's story marked the end of an era. He represented one of the last true executioners in the medieval mold. Born into the trade, steeped in clannish tradition, he devoted himself to the bloody craft in his own way. But by the 20th century, the age of the hooded headsman was rapidly fading. Even in his twilight years, Reichardt came to believe that the practice was anachronistic and inhumane. He supported the abolition of capital punishment in Germany after the fall of Nazism, despite his livelihood depending on its continuation. In that sense, he followed the reluctant executioner's arc to its natural conclusion. While the details differ, the themes resonate across centuries and borders in the lives of medieval executioners. Men like Sanson, Ascan, and Reichardt were united by the uniquely heavy burden they bore in service of the state. They were indispensable, yet expendable, powerful, yet powerless. Though the stereotypical Black Hood has largely faded from modern society, capital punishment persists in certain places, as do those who administer it. While the methods may have evolved, the fundamental tension between law and morality endures. In essence, the executioner's story is a narrative of grappling with society's darkest impulses and the essence of justice itself. It's a tale of individuals caught between worlds, reviled yet essential ordinary men who carried out extraordinary and heinous acts. Their lives were a study in contradictions. So, when you lie awake at night, troubled by the world's worries, consider for a moment the inner life of the medieval executioner. His existence was a grim and solitary one, filled with blood, coin, power and pain, purpose and damnation. While it may seem like a relic of a distant and more brutal era, the executioner's burdens may not be so different from our modern relationship with justice and punishment. Have we truly progressed as much as we'd like to believe? These were the heavy thoughts that weighed on the mind as the executioner wiped down his blade and retreated to his austere stone chamber. Tomorrow would bring another judgment, another hooded walk to the scaffold, another sober swing of the sword. He would be prepared to fulfill his duty. But for now, in the darkness of night, he would try not to dream of severed necks and crimson stains. He would strive to remember that there was still a man beneath the black hood, flawed and weary as any other, yet one who bore the weight of a heavy blood-soaked history. Such is the executioner's fate. In those days of yore, the kingdom was a brutal place, and no man knew that better than the executioner. While the nobles and clergy retreated to their comfortable manors and abbeys, the executioner returned to his Spartan cottage on the outskirts of town, as far removed from respectable society as his grim profession allowed. Even in his solitude, the executioner could never fully escape the haunting presence of death that clung to him like a shadow. It followed him through the muddy streets, where widows and orphans hurled rotten fruit and vulgar curses. It seeped into his restless dreams, where the faces of the condemned flickered behind his eyelids. In those dreams he sometimes found himself upon his own scaffold, gazing out at a jeering crowd as another black-hooded figure sharpened his blade. The executioner's only hope for a semblance of peace lay in the bottles of wine and ale he could afford, with his generous, albeit blood-soaked, salary. With every sip, he sought to drown out the echoes of the dying and quiet the clamoring of his own conscience. By the light of a flickering candle, he might reflect on the twisted path that had led him to this life. After all, many executioners hadn't sought out the profession, it had been thrust upon them, whether by birth or circumstance. In France, the office of executing criminals had long been a hereditary position passed down from father to son. The Sanson dynasty of executioners had presided over France's most notable beheadings for centuries. Ever since Charles Sanson first picked up the great sword under Louis XIII in 1622, the Sansons had ruled from a far humbler abode in a Paris neighborhood reserved for society's outcasts. There, a young Charles Henry Sanson had learned the grim robes from his austere father in the 1700s. Their household was a place where decapitated heads and torture devices were spoken of as casually as the weather. While other fathers passed down wisdom or a family trade, the elder Sanson bequeathed an encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy to his son. Together they would pore over anatomical diagrams of the neck, the spine, the veins and arteries. To deliver a swift and precise death blow, the executioner needed not only strength but also impeccable aim and a keen sense of positioning. A botched execution, marked by excessive strokes of the axe or sword, was considered a grave disgrace. Under his father's stern tutelage, Charles Henry learned to recite the ritualized lines of formality as if by rote. In the name of the king, he was sentenced to death by beheading. Even in the face of the most heinous criminals, the Sanson prided themselves on a cold, detached professionalism. An executioner could not afford to show pity or pleasure in his bloody task, lest he lose his grip on his sanity. However, beneath the elder Sanson's gruff exterior, there were fleeting glimpses of a man burdened by a lifetime of delivering death to the downtrodden. In rare, unguarded moments, he confessed to his son the gnawing guilt and gruesome flashbacks that haunted his twilight years. This chilling omen foreshadowed the inner demons that the young Charles Henry would battle as he ascended to the role of France's royal executioner. The training was as much mental as physical, demanding a strict regimen of emotional detachment and unwavering composure. An executioner who wavered or blanched at the sight of blood would not survive in this trade. With practice and time, Charles Henry learned to adopt the impassive mask expected of his station. Yet, despite his efforts, he could never fully harden his heart to the suffering he inflicted. Even the most stoic executioners were still made of mortal flesh and blood, with their own fears and frailties simmering beneath the surface. Charles Henry's father had not lived to witness his son's inner turmoil reach its peak when the reign of terror plunged Paris into an unprecedented frenzy of bloodletting. As the dreaded guillotine began claiming victim after victim, from deposed royals to hapless peasants, the younger Sanson found himself presiding over a veritable conveyor belt of carnage. As the severed heads piled up in gruesome mounds and the cobblestones ran red, even a seasoned executioner like Charles Henry found it challenging to maintain his composure amidst the sheer volume and gruesome repetition of the purge. By day, his face remained an unreadable mask as he mechanically pulled the lever, witnessing the razor-sharp blade descend with a final slice and thud. However, by night, the horrors of his work overwhelmed him, causing him to experience trembling fits and waking nightmares. This trauma would haunt Charles Henry for the rest of his days, long after the reign of terror had given way to a more peaceful and stable era. In his memoirs, he expressed his lingering anguish and the heavy conscience he carried to his grave. At night, as he lay on his pallet, he confessed that all the scenes of horror and carnage he had witnessed during the day would resurface in his imagination, disturbing his sleep. Charles Henry was not alone in feeling the weight of his gruesome deeds upon his soul. Although they may have appeared hardened men of steel on the surface, many still grappled with the moral burden of their thankless task. Some sought solace in religion, fervently praying for the salvation of the souls they dispatched. Others, as we have heard, turned to the numbing refuge of drink. However, the executioner's plight was often one of isolation, cut off from the comforts and means of coping that were available to other men. Even the church, which relied on the headsman to carry out its grim punishments, regarded him with uneasy suspicion. Executioners were forbidden from taking the sacrament, and many priests undoubtedly questioned whether God's forgiveness extended to professional killers, even those who were legally sanctioned. Consequently, while France's executioners may have been indispensable agents of the king's justice, their reward was a lifetime of loneliness and alienation from nearly every aspect of society. Some bore this fate with grim resignation, while others carried it with embittered resentment, but none could truly escape it. As the Sanson and numerous other executioner dynasties could attest, Once a man donned the axe and the black hood, he was forever marked by his macabre trade. Even after Charles Henry's tenure concluded and the guillotine's thirst was quenched, that stigma persisted. As the spectacle of public executions waned and the executioner's hood was finally laid down, the shadow it cast over its wearer remained. In a world increasingly viewing capital punishment as a distasteful relic, the executioner became a pariah, shunned for a role society demanded but couldn't bear to confront. The legacy of men like Charles Henry Son was forever stained by blood and controversy. Their lives were a precarious dance between duty and damnation, sin and social necessity, a moral quandary as unsettling as the executions they performed. In their intricate tale, we find a haunting mirror reflecting society's conflicted relationship with violence, vengeance, and the value of a human soul. The executioner's hood may be gathering dust, but the questions it raised still loom. As restless as his tormented spirit, the looming spectre of death was a constant companion to all in the medieval era. No one knew this better than the town executioner, whose grim task it was to administer the ultimate punishment to the condemned. To peer back through the centuries at these dark figures is to gaze into a cracked and haunting mirror, reflecting the harshest contours of the human soul. Our story begins with a hooded man, his face etched with the weight of his duties, ascending a rickety wooden platform. Below him, a tightly packed crowd jostles for a better view, their voices rising in a mix of anticipation and dread. They have come to witness the execution of a notorious highwayman, a man whose deeds have long terrorized the roads and byways of the land. The executioner takes his position beside the block, his practiced hands adjusting the blade of his heavy axe. He stands apart, clad in the somber attire of his profession. A dark tunic and trousers, adorned only by the emblem of the city he serves, complete his appearance. His demeanor is one of grim professionalism, honed over years of escorting the doomed to the brink of eternity. As the prisoner is led forth, the crowd falls silent. The condemned man's face is pale yet resolute, his lips moving in a final prayer. Kneeling, he places his head upon the stained wood of the block. The executioner raises his axe, the blade gleaming dully in the single beam of sunlight. For a heartbeat, all is still. Then, with a whoosh of air and a sickening thud, the execution is complete. As the executioner solemnly lifts the severed head for the crowd to witness, a palpable release of tension ripples through the square. Justice in the eyes of the law and the populace has been served. The executioner has fulfilled his role, a grim tradition carried on by generations of his forebears in the somber pageant of crime and punishment. But what kind of person could endure such a brutal task day after day and year after year? What kind of life did these executioners lead? And what toll did their macabre duties take upon their hearts and minds? To answer these questions, we must delve deeper into the shadows of history. For most executioners, their trade was passed down from father to son, a grim inheritance that set them apart from their fellow citizens. From a young age, they were apprentices to a master executioner, learning the techniques of dealing death with a variety of fearsome tools, including the axe, the sword, the noose, and more. This rigorous and unforgiving education demanded not only great physical strength and precision, but also a mental fortitude bordering on the inhuman. An executioner had to learn to suppress the screams and pleas of the condemned to carry out his duties with a detached professionalism. Part of this training involved a deep study of human anatomy, a necessary precursor to ensuring a swift and relatively painless death for those sentenced to die. A skilled executioner could sever a head with a single blow or snap a neck with a swift twist of the rope. He took pride in minimizing suffering, even as he ended lives. However, no amount of training could fully prepare an executioner for the weight of his grim duties. Killing on command, day after day, exacts a heavy toll on the mind and spirit. Many executioners turned to drink to dull the pain, losing themselves in the oblivion of the bottle. Others retreated into grim solitude, shunned by a society that feared and reviled them even as it relied upon their services. It was a lonely and harrowing existence to be forever balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. An executioner walked in the Shadowlands, estranged from the world of the living, but not yet consigned to the realm of the dead. His was a twilight world forever tainted by the blood he spilled in the name of justice. Yet even within this bleak landscape, there were moments of humanity, glimmers of light amidst the pervasive darkness. In the quiet hours before a public execution, as the town square slowly filled with onlookers, the executioner would often visit the condemned in their cell, offering what small comfort he could. Sometimes it was a drink of water or a morsel of bread. Other times it was a prayer or a gentle word, a reassurance that the end would be swift and clean. These small acts of kindness were a lifeline for the doomed, a final touch of human warmth before the axe fell. Despite the gruesomeness of his trade, the executioner was not a cruel man by nature. He was a professional tasked with a necessary but awful duty. In his own way, he sought to bring a measure of dignity and solace to those he was charged with dispatching from this life. Perhaps that is why, despite the fear and loathing they inspired, executioners were also figures of dark fascination for the medieval public. Their lives were shrouded in mystery and legend, their personas a source of grim tales and whispered rumors. Some believed that executioners possessed supernatural powers capable of communicating with the deceased or casting curses upon the living. Others claimed that talismans crafted from hanging ropes or shards of blood-stained axes could ward off evil or cure diseases. A few enterprising executioners even capitalized on these superstitions, selling macabre souvenirs to those with a taste for the macabre. However, for most executioners, the weight of their chosen profession was a burden to endure, not a source of celebration. They lived their lives in the long shadow of the scaffold, forever marked by the dark deeds they committed in the name of king and country. Even the most hardened executioners could not fully escape the toll of their grim trade. In the quiet of the night, when the crowds had dispersed and the blood had been washed away, the memories of the condemned would resurface. The pleas for mercy, the looks of terror, and the awful finality of the blades would haunt them. Some sought solace in religion, praying for the souls of those they had dispatched, and for the salvation of their own troubled spirits. Others retreated into themselves, erecting high walls around their hearts and minds to keep out the nightmares. Yet none could entirely escape the spectre of death that clung to them like a shroud. In the end, executioners' lives were one of bleak necessity, vital yet horrifying cogs in the machinery of medieval justice. They were the last faces the condemned would ever see, the dealers of society's harshest and most irreversible punishment. Despite the darkness and brutality that attended their profession, executioners were also human beings, flawed, conflicted, and forever burdened by the weight of their grim duties. To remember them is to gaze unflinchingly at the darkest recesses of our shared history and ponder the toll that violence and retribution exact on the human soul. As we delve into the shadows of the past, we are reminded of the delicate balance between justice and vengeance, and the immense sacrifices made by those who tread this perilous path. The executioner's story serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the darkness that resides within the human heart, and the steep cost of suppressing it. Charles H. Rye Sanson, a renowned executioner who operated in Paris during the tumultuous French Revolution, exemplifies this complex dynamic. Born into a lineage of executioners dating back to the 1600s, Sanson was deeply ingrained in the grim traditions of his forebears. From a young age, he was meticulously trained by his father in the dark arts of the blade and the noose. By the time he reached adulthood, Sanson had become a master of his craft, a grim virtuoso in the theatre of public execution. Despite his skill and pedigree, Sanson was not immune to the toll of his chosen trade. In his memoirs written in his later years, he candidly expressed the heavy burden and constant weight of death that accompanied his work. He described the profound responsibility of holding the power of life and death in one's hands, serving as the instrument of the law's ultimate sanction. This responsibility, he acknowledged, never becomes easier, regardless of the number of executions performed. Sanson carried out his duty with grim efficiency, making him one of the most prolific executioners in French history. Over the course of his long career, he personally executed nearly 3,000 individuals, ranging from common thieves and murderers to aristocrats and royalty. His most infamous moment occurred in January 1793, when he presided over the execution of King Louis XVI himself. This pivotal event was fraught with danger and historical significance, as the fate of a nation hung in the balance. Samson, a consummate professional, carried out his duties with a cool precision. He severed the monarch's head with a single stroke of the blade. Yet even in this moment of grim triumph, Samson was haunted by the weight of his actions. In his memoirs, he describes the strange intimacy of the act, the feeling of the king's lifeblood spattering his face and hands. In that instant, he wrote, "I felt the full burden of my office, the awful responsibility of being the one to end the life of God's anointed sovereign." This burden would stay with Samson for the rest of his days, even as he continued to execute people through the bloody years of the Reign of Terror. With each execution, each fall of the blade, he felt himself slipping further into the abyss, his soul stained by the blood of the condemned. Despite these darkest moments, Samson clung to a grim sense of professional pride, believing in the necessity of his work. He saw himself as an instrument of justice, a bulwark against the chaos and lawlessness threatening the land. In his mind, he was a servant of the greater good, even if that service required him to wade through an ocean of blood and suffering. It was a delicate balance, one that demanded constant negotiation between his sense of duty and the toll it exacted on his soul. Ultimately, Samson's story is a testament to the strange and complex psychology of the executioner. It highlights the mental and emotional contortions required to carry out such a grim and weighty task. It serves as a reminder that even those who deal in death are not immune to its ravages. The act of killing, even in the name of justice, leaves an indelible mark on the psyche. Despite the darkness and horror that attended his profession, Samson remained a figure of grim fascination for the people of his time. His name was whispered in taverns and marketplaces, and his deeds became the stuff of grisly legend. In a peculiar way, he became a symbol of the era's stark contradictions, the tension between the lofty ideals of the Enlightenment and the brutal realities of the revolutionary period. As we reflect on Samson's life from centuries away, it's easy to view him as a monstrous figure, a cold-blooded killer who executed human lives with the detachment of a butcher slaughtering cattle. However, this perspective overlooks the intricate web of duty, tradition, and necessity that bound him to his grim profession. Ultimately, Samson was a product of his time and place, tasked with fulfilling society's darkest impulses. His skill and professionalism in carrying out this task are a testament to his resilience in the face of unimaginable horror, not to his inhumanity. Yet even as we contemplate the grim necessity of his work, we can't help but shudder at the toll it must have taken on his soul. Living in the constant shadow of death and forever stained by the blood of the condemned is a fate few would choose, and even fewer could bear. As the sun sets on another day and the last of the crowd disperses from the execution site, we are left to ponder the enigmatic and haunting figure of the executioner. He serves as a reminder of the savagery that resides within the human heart and the high price we pay to suppress it. However, he also stands as a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit, our ability to persevere even in the face of the darkest circumstances. In his own grim way, the executioner acts as a guardian of order, a bull fighting against the chaos that constantly threatens to engulf us. Therefore, we remember him not with love or admiration, but with a somber respect for the weight he carried, the sacrifices he made, and the peculiar and terrible role he played in the grand tapestry of human history. As we drift off to sleep, burdened by the weight of these somber reflections, we find solace in the knowledge that our world has largely transcended the need for such grim services. The days of public executions where hooded men wielded axes are long gone. Yet as we celebrate this progress, we must not forget the lessons of the executioner's tale, the fragility of justice, the high cost of retribution, and the indomitable human spirit's ability to endure even the darkest trials. Ultimately, the executioner's story is our story, a testament to our progress and the journey ahead towards a more just and humane world. It haunts and instructs us even as it fades into history. So let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that the executioner's grim vigil has ended and a new day dawns upon a world forever transformed by his dark deeds. Let us carry with us the memory of his sacrifice as we strive to build a future where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. For in the end, the executioner's legacy is not one of death and despair, but of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, a spirit capable of enduring even the darkest nights and emerging into the light of a brighter dawn. The executioner's paradox was a peculiar and tragic one. These men, predominantly men, were both indispensable and reviled in medieval society. They served as the ultimate enforcers of the law, delivering the ultimate punishment to the guilty. Yet in doing so, they were perceived as tainted, destined to live on the fringes of respectable society. It's challenging for us to comprehend today, but try to envision the solitary and conflicted life of a medieval executioner. By day, he dealt out death, his hands stained crimson with the blood of the condemned. He stood on the scaffold, presiding over the grim spectacle of public executions. With a solemn nod of his hooded head, he would signal the drums to cease, the crowd to fall silent, and then, with a swift practice stroke of his sword or a hard pull on the rope, he would send another soul to face the final judgment. However, despite their essential role, executioners were never truly accepted. To the pious and superstitious medieval mind, there was something inherently unholy about a man who killed for a living, even if it was sanctioned by the law. Consequently, executioners were often forced to reside on the outskirts of town in small dark houses, away from respectable folk. They were barred from most social gatherings and celebrations, and even stepping foot in a church was forbidden to them. Many executioners grappled with the immense weight of their grim duties. While some were hardened men who found cruel satisfaction in their work, others were more conflicted, struggling to reconcile their role with their conscience. It was a heavy burden to bear, knowing that their hands were destined to end the lives of so many, even if they were criminals condemned by the courts. This psychological toll could manifest in various ways. Some executioners turned to drink, drowning their demons in ale and wine. There are tales of executioners who would imbibe to the point of near stupefaction before each execution so that their hands wouldn't shake and they could pretend not to hear the screams. For them, alcohol was the only balm for a tortured soul. Others fell into deep melancholy, growing increasingly sullen and withdrawn. They would go about their days in a grim stupor, speaking to no one, consumed by the dark thoughts in their head. There are even stories of executioners who, driven mad by guilt and isolation, took their own lives, hanging themselves from the very gallows where they had sent so many to die. Despite the ostracization they faced, executioners were not entirely powerless. In fact, they could wield a peculiar sort of authority in medieval society. After all, they were the ones entrusted with the ultimate sanction of the law. Even the mightiest, most noble or wealthiest merchant had a reason to fear the executioner's blade. Some executioners exploited this unique position for their own gain. They would charge money for a swift and painless death, a final mercy for those who could afford it. Others marketed grim souvenirs from the execution site, such as scraps of the rope, locks of the dead man's hair, and vials allegedly filled with blood. These were considered powerful talismans by the superstitious masses, imbued with the fearlessness of the execution. In certain cases, executioners could even rise to a form of prominence. For instance, consider the case of Franz Schmidt, an executioner in Nuremberg, Germany, active in the late 1500s. Schmidt presided over hundreds of executions, beheadings, and acts of torture. Unlike many of his counterparts, Schmidt shrewdly leveraged his position. He meticulously documented his work in a personal journal that survives to this day. Over decades of service, he amassed a small fortune in payments for his deadly duties. With that money, Schmidt made an unlikely social climb. He purchased a lavish home in the heart of Nuremberg, a grand stone affair that sent tongues wagging among the city's elite. He even managed to secure special dispensations to attend church services and social gatherings normally denied to one of his profession. For a time, Franz Schmidt defied all custom and improbably rose to join the ranks of Nuremberg's most prominent citizens. However, Schmidt's story is a rare exception. Far more common was the executioner who lived and died in lonely ignominy, forever burdened by his dark trade. For most of these men, the only escape from their grim lot was the grave. They would pass their trade down to their sons as it had been passed to them, an inheritance of blood and shame. In time, the profession of the medieval executioner would fade away, rendered obsolete by changing attitudes and technologies. The spectacle of public beheadings and hangings gradually disappeared from town squares across Europe. New methods of capital punishment, such as the guillotine and later the electric chair, replaced the hooded headsman with his axe and sword. However, there is one final medieval executioner whose story deserves to be told. A man named Johann Reichardt, who served as the official executioner of Bavaria Estate in southern Germany for nearly 4 decades. Reichardt lived a peculiar double life. On the surface, he was a mild-mannered family man and a photography enthusiast. But when duty called, he would don his black hood and carry out his deadly work with cold precision. Over the course of his career, Reichardt executed more than 3,000 people, including numerous Nazi war criminals sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials. Despite the scale of death he dealt with, Reichardt maintained that he was no monster, but a professional dutifully carrying out the state's orders. Even so, he was heavily burdened by his work, sinking into depression and alcoholism in his later years. Johann Reichardt would be the last prominent executioner in German history. After the abolition of capital punishment in West Germany in 1949, he faded into obscurity. His story served as a final dark epilogue to a centuries-long tradition. And so the medieval executioner passed into the pages of history. Today, we look back on that hooded figure as a grim relic of a more barbaric time. However, if we delve deeper into his story, we might uncover a more complex truth. For in many ways, the medieval executioner occupied a unique space between light and shadow, between justice and cruelty, between duty and disgrace. He was a man who carried out brutal acts, yet was undeniably human, burdened with a guilt and loneliness that few of us can truly comprehend. To walk a mile in his heavy black boots is to confront some of the darkest chapters of our history. It's to grapple with questions of morality and mortality that still haunt us to this day, even though the hooded headsman no longer roams our town squares. As we drift off to sleep, let's spare a thought for the medieval executioner, that grim and tragic figure who carried out death in the name of the law. May we ponder his story with empathy and tranquility, and may we hope that his kind will never walk among us again. But for now, it's time to let those dark tales recede into the depths of history. Let our minds quiet and our breathing slow. The night is soft around you, gentle and inviting, beckoning you to surrender to its embrace. So let your eyes grow heavy, and let my words become a soothing hum that fades into the warm darkness of sleep. Rest now, dear listener, and may your dreams be free from the shadows of the past. Good night. The flickering torch cast eerie shadows on the executioner's weathered face as he stood stoically in the pre-dawn gloom. An icy breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying straw, but he barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the grim task ahead. With methodical focus, he began his preparations. The heavy oak workbench groaned as he laid out his tools. The great axe head, its edges honed to gleaming sharpness, the thick hemp rope, coarse and unyielding, and the sword, elegant yet deadly, entrusted to him by the Duke himself for noble beheadings. Each instrument was carefully inspected and blessed with a whispered prayer. But it was more than mere weaponry that the executioner readied that chilly morning. He steeled himself mentally and emotionally for the bloody work to come. A deep breath to center his thoughts, a sip of strong ale to fortify his spirit and steady his hands. For though he had presided over countless tortures and executions, it was never a deed he took lightly. The executioner knew he was both reviled and feared. A pariah, forced to dwell on the town's outskirts, shunned by the very society he served, found himself in a cruel irony. Tasked with the solemn duty of carrying out justice, he was bound by a birthright and a duty passed down through generations. At the tender age of 12, his father had placed the axe in his hands, marking the beginning of his dark legacy. Under his father's strict tutelage, he honed his skills, learning the precision of a neck-breaking drop, the angle of a severing blow, and the signs of a condemned soul's merciful end. However, no amount of training could prepare him for the pleading eyes, hysterical sobs, and the pungent odor of voided bowels that haunted him. Each ashen face and spurt of crimson blood seared into his memory, haunting his rare dreams and lurking at the edges of his waking thoughts, a heaviness that could never be fully lifted, even in times of rest. It was during those fleeting moments between trials and sentences that he felt most acutely alone, isolated by the burdens of his macabre betrayals. He would walk the town square at dusk, after the crowds had dispersed and the blood had been scrubbed from the cobblestones, hoping to hear snippets of mundane conversation, talk of harvest yields, childhood games, or a hearty meal. But as he passed, voices would drop to fertile whispers, and fearful sideways glances would cast his way. Some would frantically make the evil eye sign, or clutch a protective talisman. The executioner was used to this reaction, yet it stung nonetheless, a reminder that despite his vital role, he would forever be an outsider. Respected for his power over life and death, yet never accepted. The price of being the hand of justice in an often merciless time. As he gathered up the last of his tools in the somber dawn light, the executioner's thoughts drifted to the day ahead. More traitors' heads to sever, more thieves' necks to snap. Another small piece of his soul surrendered to the chopping block of duty. With a heavy sigh, he stepped out to face the waiting crowds, aware that while the law might claim victories, a part of him would always remain in the shadows. The life of a medieval executioner was undeniably brutal and unforgiving. To truly comprehend the weight they carried and the harsh realities they faced, we must delve deeper into their origins, training, and daily existence. By profiling some of the prominent executioners throughout history, we can gain a more human perspective on the men behind the hoods and axes. Consider Charles Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born in 1739 to a long lineage of state executioners dating back to the 1600s, Sanson was the fourth in his family to hold the title of Monsieur de Pararet, a Gentile euphemism for his grim office. From a young age, Sanson was groomed to follow in his forefathers' footsteps. While other children played in the sunlit streets of the city, he learned the grim tools of the trade in shadowed chambers. His education was one of death, teaching him the precise angle needed to cleanly sever a head, the correct portion of body weight to ensure a swift hanging, and the vital signs of a departed soul. However, Sanson was not an unthinking brute or bloodthirsty sadist. By all accounts, he was an intelligent and sensitive man who grappled with the moral implications of his work. In his memoirs, he expressed the dreadful anxiety he felt before each execution and the violent emotions that followed. These duties took a heavy psychic toll on him. Over his long career, Sanson personally executed nearly 3,000 condemned souls, including murderers, thieves, forgers, and rebels. Their blood flowed like a dark river through the years of his service, but no execution would test Sanson's resolve more than that of the deposed King Louis XVI himself. On a frigid January morning in 1793, Sanson found himself standing before the former monarch on the scaffold. In that tense moment, as he gazed into the king's resigned eyes and raised his blade, one can only imagine the whirlwind of emotions that raged within him. Here was the divine ruler of France, brought low and handed over to the executioner's hand by the relentless forces of revolution. With a swift and decisive stroke, the deed was done. As he held aloft the king's severed head to the roaring crowd, Sanson transcended his role as a mere executioner. He became an embodiment of the people's will, a grim symbol of the new order emerging from the blood-soaked cobblestones. This task, thrust upon him by the tides of history, was never something he sought, but one he had to fulfill. In the turbulent years that followed, as the revolution consumed itself and the guillotine's appetite grew insatiable, Sanson grappled with the conflict between his sworn duty and his mounting distaste for the work. Privately, he began to question the ease with which the revolutionaries dispatched their enemies to the blade and the mindless bloodlust of the mob. Yet, ever the professional, he continued presiding over the executions of once powerful nobles and former allies of the revolution alike. Marie Antoinette, Danton, Robespierre, their deaths were all meted out by his hand, even as his spirit grew heavy with the weight of so much carnage. This burden would accompany him for the rest of his days. Even after retiring and passing on his grim mantle to his son Henri, the elder son withdrew from public life, seeking solace in quiet contemplation and the writing of his memoirs. However, the spectre of the guillotine and the faces of the condemned were never far from his thoughts. In the end, Charles Henri Sanson embodied the brutal paradox of the executioner's life. a man of moral complexity and human frailty forced to carry out inhuman acts in the name of justice. His story serves as a testament to the profound toll such a grim responsibility exacts on the soul and offers a glimpse into the harsh realities faced by those who wielded the blade in medieval and early modern times. However, not all executioners were as introspective or haunted as Sanson. Some, like the Yorkshire hangman Thomas Assin, found ingenious ways to capitalize on their macabre reputation. Assin, who began his trade in the late 1500s, was renowned for his entrepreneurial spirit as much as his skill with a noose. Recognizing the fearful fascination many held for his profession, Assin began to market grim souvenirs and dubious cures on the side. He sold lengths of used hanging rope to superstitious villagers who believed that a portion of the fatal hemp could ward off evil spirits or cure various ailments. Even more audaciously, Assin bottled and sold his own bathwater, claiming it possessed holy powers to heal the sick. Gullible peasants and merchants captivated by the hangman's sinister aura would pay handsomely for a chance to imbibe the murky liquid or dip their afflicted limbs in it. Through this morbid entrepreneurship, Assin amassed a substantial fortune to supplement his executioner's salary. It was a rare instance of an executioner leveraging their grim trade for profit and achieving a degree of financial security. However, it also highlights the peculiar double-edged nature of the executioner's reputation. On one hand, men like Ascan and Sanson were reviled and feared as harbingers of death. Their mere presence was enough to make ordinary people recoil or resort to superstitious gestures. They were forced to live on the fringes of society, literally and figuratively, in the shadows of the gallows. On the other hand, the executioner was also a figure of morbid fascination and even grudging respect. Their intimate knowledge of death and their unwavering ability to execute it gave them an aura of dark power and mystery. It was this perverse allure that Ascan so shrewdly exploited through his gruesome wares. In medieval times, the executioner held a paradoxical position as both a necessary evil and a fearsome authority. While undeniably brutal and involved in gruesome work, they were also indispensable agents of the state and the social order. In an era where public executions served as a means of maintaining control rather than solely delivering justice, the executioner emerged as the ultimate enforcer of the law. Their grim visage on the scaffold or at the chopping block served as a potent symbol of the consequences of transgression and the power of the ruling class. Consequently, executioners were both employed and empowered by the very society that shunned them. This peculiar and contradictory existence is vividly captured in the words of British author and historian Alison Weir, who wrote about the life of a typical medieval executioner. Despite being despised and avoided, they were entrusted with the authority of life and death over their fellow creatures. They embodied mortality and the omnipotence of the law. This duality, the reviled pariah wielding the power of life and death, explains the executioner's unique and unenviable place in medieval society. They were the ultimate outsiders, cut off from the warmth of human connection and common comfort. However, they also served as dark pillars of the established order, their fearsome presence essential to upholding the king's peace. This role exacted a heavy toll on both their bodies and souls. The back-breaking labor of erecting gibbets, the bone-rattling impact of each beheading stroke, and the stench of blood and bowels clinging to their clothes were just the physical hardships of the executioner's trade. But it was the mental and emotional anguish that proved even more corrosive over time. Rare was the executioner who did not turn to drink to numb the pain of their dark deeds. Many succumbed to deep melancholy or fits of rage, their minds unhinged by the proximity to such suffering and death. For how could any man, regardless of his fortitude, remain unaffected by such relentless darkness? To repeatedly kill, witness the final throes and terrors of the condemned, and endure their desperate pleas and dying curses would scar even the most resilient souls. Yet for generations of executioners like Sanson and Ascan, this was their inescapable fate. Born into a dynasty of death, trained in the grim arts of ending life, and entrusted with carrying out the implacable decrees of law and crown, they were prisoners of their dark inheritance, condemned to a life drenched in blood and shunned by their fellow man. It is perhaps fitting that the golden age of the executioner began to wane in the 1700s and 1800s as the medieval world order gave way to the modern age. The rise of Enlightenment ideals, emphasizing human dignity and reason, made the brutal public spectacle of executions increasingly barbaric and outdated. Simultaneously, new methods of capital punishment, such as the guillotine and later the electric chair, began to replace the traditional tools of the executioner's trade. These technological innovations made death quicker, more efficient, and less overtly bloody, a stark contrast to the protracted agonies of the medieval scaffold. As public tastes and sensibilities evolved, the executioner's once fearsome aura gradually dissipated. Where they were once seen as dark agents of order and authority, they came to be perceived as cruel anachronisms, relics of a more brutal era. The hooded figure wielding an axe, once a potent symbol of state power, transformed into a cartoonish cliché, a source of gallows humor rather than genuine fear. This decline is poignantly captured in the story of Johann Reichardt, Bavaria's last state executioner. Born into the twilight of his grim profession, Reichardt witnessed the final spasms of capital punishment in Germany. During the dark years of Nazi rule, he found himself presiding over the clandestine executions of political prisoners and dissidents. In a cruel twist of fate, he was compelled to execute the very men who had once employed him. The crumbling regime sought to conceal evidence of its atrocities during the war's chaotic final days. This grim conclusion marked the end of centuries of brutal tradition, where the executioner became an accessory to the worst excesses of tyranny and oppression. With the fall of the Third Reich and the abolition of capital punishment in West Germany, Reichardt and his kind faded into obscurity. The medieval executioner stands as a haunting reminder of the cruelty and darkness that once dominated human affairs. He embodied the brutal contradictions of an age when life was cheap and death was ever present. Their stories, from Charles Orion's anguished confessions to Thomas Ascan's gallows humor, offer a glimpse into the harsh realities of a world where justice was swift, merciless, and drenched in blood. The executioner was both the instrument of order and a symbol of its most primal brutality. While we may recoil at their grim trade and the casual cruelty of their era, we cannot help but feel a twinge of fascination and even pity for these dark souls. They were, in the end, as much victims of their time and station as the condemned individuals they executed. As Charles Henry's son himself reflected on a life steeped in death, he confessed, "I have killed, it is true, but it was not of my own volition. I have always detested my horrible profession, but I had to carry out my orders." This sentiment echoes across the centuries, a reminder of the heavy toll exacted on those who served as the brutal hand of justice in a merciless age. As we consign the medieval executioner to the shadows of history, we are left to ponder the darkness that once dwelled in the human heart and the hard progress that has brought us to a more enlightened, if still imperfect, present. For while the hooded figure wielding the axe may have vanished, the spectre of cruelty and the relentless pursuit of retribution continue to haunt our world. It is incumbent upon us to confront these dark impulses with the light of compassion and reason, to acknowledge the brutal past while striving for a more just and humane future. As we lay our heads down to rest, let us spare a moment of reflection for the medieval executioner, that grim and tragic figure who once cast a long shadow over the nightmares of our ancestors. May their dark legacy serve as a poignant reminder of the progress we have made and the challenges that lie ahead in our unending quest for justice and human dignity. Content warning: this script contains descriptions of medieval torture and violence. As the executioner's heavy footsteps reverberate across the town square, the murmuring crowd falls into an eerie silence. A palpable tension hangs in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke from the flickering torches. The hooded figure ascends the wooden platform, his eyes fixed on the condemned man kneeling before the block. With a solemn nod, he raises his gleaming axe high overhead, poised to deliver the final blow. Such grim scenes unfolded countless times across medieval Europe, with the executioner serving as the grim enforcer of justice. These somber men, often born into the profession and trained from a young age, wielded immense power over life and death. Despite their fearsome reputation and gruesome duties, the executioners themselves led a harsh and solitary existence on the fringes of society. Imagine, if you will, the life of a typical medieval executioner. Picture a child barely old enough to lift a sword, learning the gruesome tools of his inherited trade at his father's knee. He must study the secrets of the swift and precise blow that separates head from body, committing to memory the placements of vital arteries and organs to ensure his victims do not suffer unduly. The lessons are as much psychological as physical, as he must steel himself against the screams, the spurting blood, and the convulsing limbs of his victims. It's a heavy burden to bear on such small shoulders. As an adult, the executioner's life is a strict routine of discipline. He rises before dawn to prepare for the day's tasks. His rough hands meticulously sharpen blades, check ropes for fraying, and lay out his black hood and gloves. There's a ritual to it, a silent meditation before the butchery to come. His duties are manifold and grim. On some days he must mete out public punishments for lesser crimes, such as flogging at the whipping post or removing a pickpocket's hand. The crowds jeer and throw refuse, reviling him even as they eagerly watch the sentence carried out. But it's the executions themselves that are his prime domain. Whether it's a noble beheaded for treason or a peasant hanged for murder, he's the constant presence on the scaffold. With practiced movements, he guides the condemned into position, offers a final prayer or comforting word, and then in one swift motion, it's over. Another soul dispatched to the hereafter. He cleans his blade on a scrap of cloth and prepares for the next. It's a strange dichotomy to hold such power over fate, yet be so despised and shunned. The executioner and his family are forced to live on the outskirts of town, forbidden from most trades and unwelcome in polite society. Never mind that he serves a vital role, that he's an extension of the same law that keeps the peace. To the eyes of the public, he's death itself, a spectre in their midst. Many buckle under the strain of this isolation, taking solace in the bottom of a bottle or retreating into embittered solitude. But a rare few manage to turn their grim reputation to their advantage. Consider the clever schemes of Thomas Erskine, a 16th-century Yorkshire hangman who secretly sold bits of his hanging ropes as talismans against sickness and ill fortune. He even marketed vials of his bathwater as a holy elixir, exploiting the morbid fascination and fear his profession engendered. Through his cunning, Erskine amassed a small fortune to bequeath to his apprentice son. However, Erskine was an exception rather than the norm. For most executioners, life was a shadowy existence, forever stigmatized and burdened by the weight of their gruesome profession. Imagine yourself in their worn, blood-spattered boots, having your life's purpose be to end the lives of others. Envision the nightmares and the faces of the deceased etched behind your eyelids. It's no wonder so many succumbed to madness or took their own lives. Some, however, sought meaning or redemption in their role. Charles Henry, the royal executioner of Paris during the French Revolution, was one such man. Born into a dynasty of state executioners dating back to the 1600s, Sanson was a true professional who took pride in his work. But he was no monster. He meticulously studied anatomy to ensure his victims' swift deaths. When duty called upon him to execute the deposed King Louis himself, he agonized over it and ultimately left the trade a few short years later. Even for the Sanson of the profession, the winds of progress eventually swept executioners into obsolescence. As the Enlightenment dawned and public sentiments shifted, the demand for gruesome spectacles in town squares waned. By the 1800s, most civic executions had moved behind prison walls, replaced by new technologies like the guillotine, firing squads, and later electric chairs and lethal injections, which displaced the hooded headsman. Those who remained were pale shadows of their medieval predecessors, shameful relics of a darker, crueler era. Men like Johann Reichardt, the last executioner in Bavaria, who secretly executed Nazi war criminals with a guillotine in a grimy prison yard during the 1940s, exemplify this transformation. Once feared and powerful figures, they were reduced to macabre footnotes of history. In the end, perhaps executioners are best remembered not as the inhuman monsters of myth, but as all too mortal men, burdened with a bloody task they never sought. Certainly, we shouldn't feel much sympathy for those who found perverse pleasure in the role of the cruel and sadistic. However, for the majority who were simply fulfilling a legal, albeit distasteful duty, we can empathize with their harsh and secluded existence. So, when you find your mind wandering to a medieval town square, Envisioning the axe rising high and the swoosh of its descent, spare a thought for the man beneath the hood, a man both necessary and reviled, forever touched by the icy hand of death. The medieval executioner, a figure of awe, dread, and tragedy, stands poised on the wooden platform. The last glimmers of sunlight cast long shadows across the town square as the hooded executioner steps forward. An expectant hush falls over the gathered crowd, their faces flickering in the torchlight. They have come to witness the grim spectacle that has been a part of civilization for centuries, the public execution of a condemned criminal. With a solemn nod, the executioner acknowledges the magistrate standing at the edge of the scaffold, unfurling a scroll to read out the prisoner's final sentence. The words ring out in the evening air, sealing the man's fate. For the heinous crimes of thievery and murder, he has been sentenced to death by beheading. May God have mercy on his soul. A ragged cheer erupts from the crowd as the prisoner is led up onto the platform, his hands bound tightly behind his back. He gazes out at the sea of faces with wide, fearful eyes, his final desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. The executioner steps forward, his black hood obscuring his face as he forces the man to his knees and positions his neck over the block. In a swift, practiced motion, the executioner raises his gleaming axe high overhead. The blade catches the flickering torchlight as it arcs downward, a deadly blur of steel. A sickening thud echoes across the square as it finds its mark, followed by an eerie silence. It is done. The executioner, a grim figure, carried out his duty once more, continuing a tradition that had been passed down through generations. The life of a medieval executioner was steeped in blood and death, a paradoxical blend of justice and cruelty, necessity and brutality. These hooded figures, loathed and shunned by the society they served, were the dark thread woven through the tapestry of the Middle Ages. Though they have long faded into history, the stories of executioners offer a fascinating, albeit macabre, glimpse into a world that can sometimes seem unimaginable. In their struggles with morality, mortality, and the relentless march of justice, perhaps we can recognize shades of our common humanity, even if we don't want to admit it. The question of what kind of person becomes an executioner, whose sole purpose is to end the lives of others, has echoed through the centuries. For many, it was simply a family trade, a grim birthright passed down from father to son, an inescapable destiny. This was the case for Charles Henri, the royal executioner of Paris in the late 18th century. Born into a dynasty of executioners that traced its roots back to the 1600s, Sanson was the fourth generation to assume the mantle of the High Executioner of Paris. From a young age, he was groomed for his macabre calling, apprenticing under his uncle to master the meticulous art of dealing death. For Sanson, the training was as much mental as physical. He studied anatomy obsessively, learning precisely where to aim his blade to bring a swift end. However, he also had to confront the emotional and psychological toll of the job. Taking a life, even that of a murderer or traitor, was no easy burden to bear. Despite this, when Sanson stepped up to the scaffold, he did so with a cool professionalism and a certain grim pride in his work. With his austere black coat and powdered wig, he cut an imposing figure as he presided over the bloody business of justice. In his illustrious career as the royal executioner, Sanson personally carried out the execution of nearly 3,000 souls at the behest of the French crown. Among his most renowned clients was King Louis V, the 16th king, who bravely faced his fate at the guillotine during the Reign of Terror in 1793. Despite his familiarity with death, Sanson was said to derive no pleasure from his work. He regarded it as a solemn duty and an unavoidable, albeit tragic, function of a civilized society. He strived to minimize the suffering of the condemned, taking pride in his precise and clean strokes. Nevertheless, despite his efforts to maintain a certain professional detachment, Sanson was still a human being grappling with the weight of his grim deeds. In his moments of solitude, he would engage in philosophical musings about the nature of mortality, justice, and the role of the executioner within the grand tapestry of existence. He once mused, perhaps seeking solace for himself as much as anyone else, that in a well-governed state, the executioner's axe is as essential as the scales of justice, both indispensable for maintaining societal order. This cold comfort was a stark contrast for a man who had sent so many to their demise. In an attempt to find some semblance of normalcy, Sanson would often seek solace in the quiet joys of family life whenever possible. After a long day on the scaffold, he would return to his wife and children, shedding his blood-splattered coat and the constant spectre of death that accompanied him. However, even in these precious moments of domestic tranquility, the ghosts of the executed were never far away. How could they be when he had witnessed their final moments, felt the tremor of their last breath beneath his hands? In his later years, Sanson embarked on the delicate task of training his own son, Henri, to inherit his legacy and continue the executioner's dynasty. It was undoubtedly a bittersweet moment for the elder Sanson. What father could wish such a grim fate upon his child? Yet, who else could comprehend the immense burden he had carried for so long? As Sanson witnessed his son's tentative steps onto the scaffold, a mix of emotions swirled within him. Regret tugged at his heart, a yearning to spare his son the solitary path he had chosen. Or perhaps it was a bittersweet sense of melancholy pride, knowing that his legacy would endure. The Sanson name would forever be synonymous with death, justice, and the heavy hand of the law. History, however, remained silent on his innermost thoughts. As he gazed upon the young man before him, Sanson couldn't help but see a reflection of himself in the condemned. The old executioner grappled with the same profound questions that had haunted him throughout his long and blood-soaked career. He pondered the nature of fate and free will, the true cost of upholding order in a chaotic world. These were the weighty matters that consumed the minds of executioners, those grim reapers who stood at the crossroads of life and death, delivering the ultimate punishment in the name of king and country. Theirs was a peculiar and dreadful calling, one that set them apart from ordinary men. Despite the fear and loathing they inspired, executioners were not always content to dwell in the shadows. Some, like Thomas Ascan, found unconventional ways to capitalize on society's morbid fascination with their trade. Ascan, a hangman in the northern English county of Yorkshire during the late 1500s, was renowned for his meticulous attention to detail on the gallows. He ensured that each condemned prisoner met a swift and merciful end. However, it was his activities off the scaffold that truly captured the public's imagination. With a sly entrepreneurial streak that belied his grim profession, Ascan began peddling a peculiar array of wares. He claimed that these items could cure all manner of ailments and misfortunes. Among his most prized products were segments of the very ropes he used to dispatch his victims, which he sold as talismans against sickness and bad luck. Additionally, Ascan bottled and sold the bathwater he used to wash away the grime of his bloody work, marketing it as a potent holy water with mystical healing properties. Whether driven by desperation or a belief in the executioner's supposed occult powers, people flocked to purchase Ascan's grisly snake oils. Consequently, the cunning hangman amassed a modest fortune from his morbid side hustle. It was a peculiar twist of fate, as the reviled executioner profited handsomely from the very people who shunned and feared him. However, Ascan was nothing if not adaptable, finding a way to turn even the darkest aspects of his profession to his advantage. Of course, not all executioners were as shrewd or enterprising as Thomas Ascan. For most, their grim trade brought little more than isolation, despair, and the gnawing knowledge that they were forever tainted by the blood on their hands. Despite performing a vital service for the crown and community, executioners were universally despised and shunned. They often lived in isolated hovels on the fringes of town, forbidden from mingling with respectable society. Even their families were tainted by the same brush, with their children barred from most trades and any hope of a normal life. This ostracism took a heavy toll on the men beneath the hoods. Depression, madness, and crippling alcoholism were common fates for executioners who often sought oblivion at the bottom of a bottle. The trauma of their work, combined with the unrelenting isolation, could break even the most resilient of men. However, even in their darkest moments, the executioners held a certain power and mystique. After all, they wielded the ultimate authority over life and death, serving as the brutal enforcers of the law. Even kings and nobles watched their step around the men who could one day hold their fate in blood-stained hands. This strange dichotomy, the pariah who was also feared and respected, was the executioner's lot. They walked a lonely road forever balanced between the worlds of the living and the dead, the reviled and the necessary. It was a heavy burden, one that left deep scars on even the most stoic of souls. Despite their suffering and sacrifices, executioners were destined to fade into obscurity. As centuries passed and the thirst for blood and brutality waned, these grim figures became mere historical footnotes, shadowy spectres from a bygone era. By the 1700s and 1800s, public executions were declining across Europe and the Americas. The once common spectacle of the scaffold was increasingly viewed as a barbaric relic of a less enlightened time. Governments began to explore more humane methods of capital punishment, such as the guillotine, firing squad, and later the electric chair and lethal injection. With each passing decade, the executioner's reputation plummeted. These once feared and respected figures were now seen as mere anachronisms. Their fearsome mystique had long faded, leaving many out of work as society moved on. The story of Johann Reinhardt, the last executioner of Bavaria, serves as a poignant symbol of this decline. In the early 20th century, Reinhardt carried out his craft with the same meticulous dedication as his predecessors. He took immense pride in his work, insisting on precision and dignity in each execution. Even during the dark days of Nazi rule in the 1940s, Reinhardt remained stoic, executing the enemies of the Reich with his usual icy professionalism. He never allowed his personal feelings to interfere with his work, even as he witnessed Germany's descent into the abyss. However, when the war ended and the full extent of the Nazis' crimes came to light, Reinhardt found himself a pariah once more. The Allies, disgusted by his complicity with the regime, barred him from continuing his trade. He spent his final years in obscurity and disgrace, a relic of a time that many wish to forget. Johann Reichardt's story stands as a fitting coda to the long blood-stained history of executioners. These once formidable figures, who had instilled fear in both commoners and kings, had been reduced to mere reminders of a bygone era. The world had progressed, leaving them to fade into the annals of history. Yet, even as the executioners vanished from sight, the spectre of their dark trade persisted. For as long as there has been law, there has been punishment, and the need for someone to administer the ultimate sanction. Whether through axe and rope or needle and syringe, the grim work of the executioner endures, an eternal testament to the darkest impulses of human justice. As we reflect on the lives of these hooded figures, it's easy to perceive them as mere monsters or villains, the brutal faces of a cruel and unforgiving world. However, doing so overlooks the intricate tapestry of their existence, the heavy burdens they carried in service to the crown and community. Their lives were marked by isolation and despair, perpetually teetering between necessity and brutality. They were the unwilling avatars of justice in an era when justice was often equated with vengeance and bloodshed. In their stories, we glimpse the peculiar paradoxes of power and punishment that have reverberated through the ages. Although the executioners have long since vanished into the mists of history, their legacy endures as a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks at the fringes of human civilization. In their tortured souls and blood-stained hands, we find a reflection of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, mercy and retribution. So, perhaps as we consign these grim figures to the shadows of the past, we would be wise to remember the burdens they bore on behalf of a society that detested them. Theirs was a dreadful calling, a life steeped in death and despair, yet one that serves as a mirror to the darkest recesses of the human soul. In that reflection, if we peer closely enough, we might just catch a glimpse of ourselves and the unsettling realization that the line between justice and cruelty is often far thinner than we'd like to believe. It's a sobering thought that echoes through the ages, from the blood-soaked scaffold to the sterile execution chamber. After all, the story of the executioners isn't just a tale of a bygone era. It's a dark thread woven through the very fabric of human history. It speaks to the eternal dance between civilization and savagery, the price we're willing to pay for order in a chaotic world. While we may recoil from the barbarity of the past, we can't escape the long shadow it casts over our present. For as long as there's law, there'll be punishment, and someone tasked with carrying out the grim work of justice. It's a heavy legacy that weighs on us all, whether we wield the axe or simply turn a blind eye to the blood spilled in our name. In the tortured lives of the executioners, we see the reflection of our own struggles with morality and mortality, the price of our uneasy pact with the forces of order and retribution. So, as we consign these dark figures to history's dustbin, let's pause to ponder the burdens they bore and the lessons they leave behind. After all, their story isn't just theirs, it's ours, a reminder of the darkness that dwells within us all and the eternal struggle to balance the scales of justice in an often merciless world. As the last echoes of the executioner's tale fade into silence, we're left to grapple with these weighty questions in the quiet of our own hearts. Though the answers may be elusive, the asking is its own form of reckoning, a chance to confront the shadows that lurk within and without. Ultimately, the story of the executioners is a mirror held up to the human condition, a reflection of our darkest impulses and our noblest ideals. In that reflection, we may just find a glimmer of understanding, a chance for empathy and grace in a world that often seems devoid of both. So, let us remember the executioners not as monsters or villains, but as fallible tortured souls forever trapped between the forces of light and darkness. By remembering them, let us strive to build a world where their grim trade is no longer necessary. A world where justice and mercy walk hand in hand and the shadow of the scaffold fades into the light. For that, in the end, is the executioner's final legacy. Not the blood spilled or the lives taken, but the chance for us to learn from the past's mistakes and chart a new course for the future. It's a heavy responsibility, but one we all share, to build a world where cruelty and vengeance give way to compassion and grace. Though the road ahead may be long and the shadows deep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we do not walk alone. For in the end, we are all heirs to the executioner's legacy, the suffering and the sorrow, the hope and the redemption. It's a burden we all must bear, a story that belongs to us all. And in the telling, perhaps we can find the strength to write a new ending, one where the executioner's tale is not a warning, but a promise of a brighter tomorrow. So, let us go forth with heavy hearts and steadfast spirits, carrying the weight of history on our shoulders. For in the end, it is up to us to shape the future, to build a world where the executioner's shadow fades into memory and the light of justice shines bright for all to see. As Johann Reichardt's grim career drew to a close, so too did the age of the traditional executioner. These dark figures, once a ubiquitous presence looming over medieval town squares, faded into the mists of history. Their blood-stained legacy became a fading memory, a shadowy reminder of a harsher, more brutal time. Yet even as the hooded axeman and the gallows noose receded from public view, the spectre of capital punishment lingered on. In hushed prison chambers and clinical execution rooms, the task of administering society's ultimate sanction took on new forms. The electric chairs crackled with sizzling energy, and the lethal injections exuded an eerie stillness, replacing the sword's whistling slash and the trapdoor's fatal creak. While more sterile and concealed, death's justice persisted. As we reflect on the executioner's macabre trade, it's tempting to perceive these figures as sadistic monsters or heartless machines. However, beneath the hoods and behind the masks, there beat the troubled hearts of men, burdened with a terrible duty and a grim responsibility that set them apart. Certainly some reveled in cruelty, indulging in pain and fear, but others, perhaps most, were prisoners of circumstance, heirs to a family trade, a dark destiny, cogs in a vast machine of law and suffering. They were pied and shunned, yet also feared and strangely respected. Their existence was a twilight one, perpetually balanced between the worlds of the living and the dead. To walk in the executioner's shoes, to bear his heavy axe and heavier conscience, is to confront the darkest extremes of the human condition. The stark finality of the death penalty, the uneasy relationship between justice and vengeance, the psychological toll of violence, whether enacted or merely witnessed, these troubling questions have haunted us throughout history and continue to do so. Perhaps the hooded figure of the executioner is not a remote relic, but an enduring archetype, a reflection of society's struggle to balance order and compassion, righteousness and mercy. In the executioner's haunted eyes and harrowed face, we may glimpse a part of ourselves, a reminder that even the most enlightened civilization must still grapple with the primal forces of darkness and light. Ultimately, the medieval executioner's story is the story of human civilization itself, a halting, fitful climb from brutality to reason, from vengeance to justice, from savagery to mercy, a journey that continues to unfold, a tale whose final chapter remains unwritten. While the axe and the noose may fade into history's dustbin, the executioner's complex legacy endures. In our ongoing struggle to balance justice and humanity, we are all the executioner's heirs. Our shared hopes for a brighter tomorrow are tethered to the wisdom gleaned from his dark example. We may shudder at his memory, but we must never forget his lesson. Violence, even when cloaked in the grandeur of law, exacts a terrible toll on both the victim and the wielder. Only by confronting the darkness of our past can we hope to find our way towards a more enlightened future. As we drift off to sleep, let us spare a solemn thought for the medieval executioner, that grim reaper, that shunned shadow, a figure of dread and fascination, of cruelty and postos, a demon and a man, a reminder of what we once were and what we must never be again. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the executioner's dark empire. If you found this tale of history's darkest profession intriguing, or if it brought you a peculiar sense of comfort as you drift off to slumber, feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more tales of history's shadowy corners to explore, more dark stars to illuminate. Until next time, pleasant dreams. And remember, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. Even for the executioner, even for us.